A kung fu master with 40 years of training across 5 traditional systems walked into Bruce Lee's school in front of 500 people and called him a fraud. He had the credentials. He had the lineage. He had 4 decades of daily practice in Shaolin techniques that had been refined across generations. He challenged Bruce Lee to prove his methods in front of the entire room. Bruce agreed, with one condition. "One technique," he said. "One strike. If you stop it, I'll shut down my school." 8 seconds later, the master was on his knees, unable to breathe, his arms still held in the perfect defensive position his 40 years had built into him. His body had not moved. His brain had not processed what happened before it had already happened. But here's the part nobody remembers. Bruce didn't celebrate. He walked forward, knelt beside the man, and placed a hand on his back. "Relax," he said quietly. "Your breath will return." No mockery. No victory speech. No acknowledgement to the room that anything remarkable had just occurred. And weeks later, the part that changed everything, the master came back. No grand entrance. No accusations. He bowed and asked to train. Bruce accepted without a word of "I told you so." Stay with this story. Because what the master said years later, about what had actually defeated him that day, was not the strike. Those of you who have spent decades building expertise inside a system understand something the younger generation is still learning. That the most dangerous moment in a long career is not failure. It is the specific rigidity that success produces. The way that decades of being right about one set of things can quietly make you wrong about everything outside them, and how that wrongness becomes invisible precisely because the success is so consistent. The master who walked into Bruce Lee's school in Seattle in 1967 was not a fraud. He was genuinely accomplished. His techniques were real. His dedication was undeniable. But 40 years inside a single framework had done something to him that he could not see from the inside. It had made the framework and the truth feel like the same thing. 8 seconds and 1 strike showed him the difference. What he did with that information is the story worth staying for. Seattle, Washington. March 1967. The city was damp and gray the way Seattle is damp and gray in March, a persistent overcast that flattens the light and makes everything look slightly more serious than it is. Martial arts in America at this time were still governed by the unwritten traditions carried over from China, Japan, and Korea. Schools were secretive, knowledge was guarded, techniques were passed down only to those deemed worthy, and teaching outsiders, particularly non-Chinese students, was considered a cultural betrayal of the highest order. Then came Bruce Lee, 26 years old, 60 kilograms. No imposing build. He could be mistaken on the street for a university student running late to a lecture. But the moment he moved, the mistake was corrected immediately and permanently by anyone watching. His small academy occupied the 2nd floor of an old brick building. Nothing flashy, a simple sign, a narrow staircase, a room that was far too small for the crowd that filled it on this particular afternoon. People stood against every wall, sat on the floor, perched by windows. The air was thick with body heat and the sharp smell of training oil and the specific charged atmosphere of a room where serious people have gathered around a serious disagreement. Bruce stood barefoot at the front, dressed simply, explaining his philosophy in the unhurried way he explained everything, as if the ideas were self-evident and the only service required was to point at them clearly so others could see what he saw. He called it no-style style. Not the abandonment of technique, but the liberation of technique from the cage of style, the recognition that a system which told you what to do had already determined what you could not do, and that real fighting happened in the territory between systems, in the adjustments and the instants and the specific moments where pre-arranged responses met unpredictable reality. He demonstrated how classic poses revealed intention too early. How rigid techniques slowed reaction time. How beauty in movement meant nothing if it failed under genuine pressure. Each demonstration was brief and clear, not performed for the room but directed at the room, the difference visible to anyone who had watched both kinds of demonstration. Half the room was his students. They had trained with him, tested his methods, and understood them in the body rather than just in the mind. The other half watched with skepticism that had hardened into something closer to hostility. To them, Bruce Lee represented a specific threat that had nothing to do with his fighting ability. If he was right, then decades of tradition were incomplete. If he was wrong, then he was exploiting martial arts for personal gain. Neither conclusion was comfortable. Both conclusions required attention. Bruce didn't argue with the skepticism. He demonstrated against it. Then the door opened. The room fell silent before anyone had consciously registered why, the specific response that certain entrances produce, where the body recognizes authority before the mind has cataloged the source of it. A tall man stood in the doorway, dressed in a formal black uniform embroidered with golden dragons. Not the martial arts costume of someone who had dressed for effect, the formal clothing of someone for whom this was simply how you dressed when you came to address a matter of professional importance. He walked forward slowly. The crowd parted without being asked. He was a senior master whose credentials were not in dispute. For decades of daily training across 5 traditional Chinese martial arts systems, a lineage that traced directly to recognized Shaolin transmission, students who revered him and practitioners throughout the Pacific Northwest community who deferred to his authority without question. He had come specifically because of Bruce Lee. Because of the things Bruce Lee was saying in public about traditional martial arts. Because of the students Bruce was accepting, non-Chinese students, students without lineage, students who were learning Chinese martial arts outside the framework that had always protected and transmitted them. He stopped in the center of the room. His voice carried both authority and contempt, the specific contempt of someone who has spent their life building something and believes they are watching it be cheapened. He accused Bruce of diluting Kung Fu, of dishonoring its legacy, of teaching a corruption dressed as innovation, of using ancient arts as a vehicle for personal fame rather than as a sacred transmission to be preserved and protected. Bruce listened without expression. The room was completely still. "What's your name?" The master introduced himself, stated his lineage, enumerated his credentials with the precise delivery of someone who has said these words many times and expects them to settle the matter. "Why are you here?" "To expose you." Loud enough for everyone to hear. Directed not at Bruce specifically but at the room, an announcement rather than a confrontation, the statement of someone who had come not to privately settle a disagreement but to publicly resolve one. "Do you want to test it?" The answer came immediately. Yes. Terms were established. The master demanded a traditional match. Bruce proposed something different. "One technique," he said. "I'll use a single strike. If you stop it, I'll shut down my school. If you cannot, you leave." The master looked at him. The proposal sounded like the most insulting thing he had been offered in 40 years of martial arts, one strike against 4 decades of mastery across 5 systems. He accepted with the complete confidence of someone who considers the outcome so obvious that accepting the terms is itself a form of generosity. The room cleared the center space with the efficiency of people who understand that something important is about to occupy it. The master took his position. Perfect stance, low, balanced, textbook precision, every detail reflecting 40 years of daily repetition that had made the form automatic, accurate, and deeply reliable. He raised his guard. His weight was correctly distributed. His structure was sound. His defense was exactly what 40 years had made it, complete within the framework his 40 years had prepared him for. Bruce stood across from him without a stance. No formal positioning, no visible preparation, just the loose balanced neutrality that was his default state, the state from which any movement was equally available because no particular movement had been committed to. "I'll strike to the solar plexus," Bruce said. "Defend however you like." The master nodded. The room held its breath. The strike arrived. No wind-up. No telegraphing. No preparatory shift that a trained eye could catch and respond to. Just the motion itself, his fist traveling from its starting position to the target along the most direct path available, arriving at the contact point before the defensive system that 40 years had built could complete the process of recognizing what it was responding to. The sound was sharp and heavy simultaneously, the specific acoustic quality of concentrated force delivered to a precise anatomical location. The master's arms were still in their guard position. His brain had not finished processing the input. His defensive system had not issued the instruction. His body had not received the command. The technique that 40 years had refined to a level of genuine excellence was simply not fast enough to respond to something that had already happened before the response was initiated. His breath left completely. Not gradually, all at once, the diaphragm locking in the specific spasm that a precisely placed solar plexus strike produces, the breathing mechanism suspending itself in the total involuntary way that this particular anatomical target produces in any human body regardless of how much training surrounds it. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. His legs gave way and he went to his knees, arms still raised, still holding the perfect guard that had not been fast enough, clutching his abdomen with the involuntary motion of a body trying to protect the site of damage after the damage had already been received. 8 seconds. From the moment Bruce stepped into the moment the master fell. 40 years against one technique. 1 second and a half of motion. The entire room was frozen. Bruce walked forward. He knelt beside the master and placed a steady hand on his back. "Relax. Your breath will return." No arrogance in his voice. No acknowledgement to the 500 people watching that anything unusual had occurred. The tone of someone providing practical information to a person who needed it, calm, direct, genuinely concerned rather than performing concern. The master's breath began to return. Shallow at first, each increment arriving with the specific relief of a mechanism resuming a function it had been performing automatically until it stopped. He looked up at Bruce from his knees, the specific expression of a man whose certainty has been revised by the most direct means available and who is honest enough to sit with the revision rather than argue against it. He was not humiliated. He was helped. The room felt that distinction. The shift was audible in the quality of the silence, from the frozen silence of shock to the different silence of comprehension. Bruce stood, helped the master to a seated position, and returned to the front of the room. He did not frame what had happened as a victory. He did not address the crowd about what it demonstrated. He simply continued. Weeks later, the master returned. No formal announcement. No grand entrance. No uniform embroidered with golden dragons. He came through the door of the second-floor academy in plain clothes and stood at the edge of the room and waited. When Bruce acknowledged him, he bowed. Not the quick nod of tournament courtesy. The full, deliberate bow of someone who has processed something and arrived at a different position than the one they held before they processed it. He asked to train. Bruce accepted without hesitation, without condition, without any visible acknowledgement that this was remarkable. He introduced the master to the other students, assigned him to a training group, and continued the session. In the months that followed, the transformation was visible to everyone who trained there. The master stopped defending tradition as though tradition and truth were the same thing. He started asking what worked. He stopped measuring techniques against the standard of how they had always been done and started measuring them against the standard of whether they functioned against genuine resistance under genuine pressure. He retained everything 40 years had given him. The foundation was real and he kept it, but he stopped treating the foundation as the ceiling. He eventually helped teach, passing on principles that he had arrived at not through his initial training but through what had happened in those 8 seconds and in the weeks and months that followed them. The story spread through martial arts communities in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Details changed with each retelling. The number of witnesses expanded. The credentials of the master became more elaborate. The strike became more dramatic. But the core remained consistent because it was true and because the people who had been present that afternoon carried it accurately. A single strike had revealed something about the relationship between tradition and effectiveness that 500 people had watched and could not unfold in conversation. Bruce Lee was asked about it in the period after it happened, by students and journalists and practitioners who had heard some version of the account. His response was consistent. Anyone can win a fight. The real skill is helping someone grow after they lose. He meant it without performance. The growth of the man who had challenged him was not incidental to the story, it was the story. The 8 seconds were the opening of a question. The weeks and months that followed were the answer. And the master's willingness to receive the answer, to return without pride and begin again as a student, was the thing that made the encounter worth having. Years later, when people asked the master what had actually happened to him that afternoon, his answer was precise and consistent. He said, "I was not defeated by the punch. I was changed by what came after it." He had felt the strike, the specific physical reality of a diaphragm in spasm, the complete absence of air, the knees on the wooden floor. He had felt all of it. And none of it was what had changed him. What changed him was the hand on his back. The quiet instruction to relax, that the breath would return. Delivered by the man who had put him on the floor, delivered without victory in it, delivered as genuine care for a person who was currently in distress. He had come to the academy expecting to find arrogance. He had brought his own arrogance specifically to counter it. He had been prepared to meet force with force and tradition with tradition and 40 years with 40 years. He was not prepared to meet care. The care was what dismantled the defense that the 8 seconds alone could not have dismantled, the internal defense, the one made of pride and certainty and the accumulated conviction of 4 decades that the framework he had built his life inside was the complete framework. That defense was not vulnerable to a physical strike. It was vulnerable to a person who could have humiliated him and chose not to. Bruce Lee died in July 1973. He was 32 years old. He never saw what his philosophy became in the decades after his death. The way Jeet Kune Do's foundational insight, that effectiveness transcended style, became the intellectual foundation for mixed martial arts, for the modern understanding of combat sports, for the specific revolution that occurred when practitioners stopped asking which style was superior and started asking what actually worked. The master who had come to his school in Seattle in 1967 to expose him outlived him by decades. He continued teaching, in the modified and more honest form that the 8 seconds and what followed them had produced. The students he shaped in that later period of his career carried principles that traced directly back to a Wednesday afternoon in a second-floor academy and a man who had placed a hand on his back and said, "Your breath will return." In Seattle, March 1967. 500 people in a room too small for 500 people. 8 seconds. One strike. One man on his knees. And then the hand on the back. The quiet instruction. The care that was not performance. That was the real technique. Not the solar plexus strike, which was a demonstration of physical principle. The choice of what to do immediately after the demonstration was complete, the choice that determined whether the demonstration would produce a defeated opponent or a changed person. Bruce Lee was asked once what the purpose of martial arts was, in the simplest possible terms. He said, to understand yourself and then to help others understand themselves. The 8 seconds were self-expression. What he did in the seconds after them was service. The master came back because of the service. And everything that followed, the teaching, the principles transmitted, the students shaped across the decades that remained, everything followed from the hand on the back and the 6 words spoken quietly to a man on the floor of a Seattle academy who had come to tear something down and instead found something he hadn't known he needed. Your breath will return. It did. And so did he.